By late summer 1944, the Allies had won exactly the kind of victory generals dream about, a breakout so fast the enemy could not recover. And then that victory created a new threat. The front was racing across France faster than fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts could follow. Tanks were ready to keep moving. Artillery was ready to fire. But the road behind them was breaking under the weight of success. So the Allies built a rolling lifeline, a truck network that would run day and night, burn through men and machines, and turn logistics into the difference between momentum and paralysis. This is the story of the Red Ball Express, and why some of the most important fighting in Europe happened far from the front line. In the weeks after the Normandy breakout, the Allied advance became a victim of its own speed. Operation Cobra had torn open the German line, the Falaise fighting had shattered much of the enemy's position in France, and by the end of August Allied armies were pushing so fast that the map itself stopped being the main problem. Distance became the problem. Every mile east stretched the supply line farther from the beaches and ports in Normandy. Roads were crowded, railways had been wrecked by Allied bombing before D-Day, and the ports that could handle heavy cargo were either damaged, too small, or not yet fully available for the scale of the pursuit. Cherbourg mattered, but it had not been built as a major wartime cargo machine, and the old assumptions about supply simply could not keep up with the new pace of operations. This is what makes the Red Ball Express such a powerful story. It was not created because Allied planning had failed in every sense. It was created because Allied success had outrun the system that was supposed to support it. The armies in France were no longer fighting a slow, methodical campaign. They were chasing a collapsing enemy across a country whose transport network had been badly damaged and whose major ports were still not fully solving the problem. The faster the advance became, the more every commander had to confront a hard truth. An army can move only as fast as its fuel, shells, tires, and rations can move behind it. But here's the twist: the answer was not elegant. It was improvised. In late August 1944, American commanders held an emergency planning session to create an express trucking system that could move priority supplies straight to the forward areas. The result was the Red Ball Express, activated on August 25, 1944. Its name came from old railroad terminology for priority freight, and that tells you almost everything about the mindset behind it. This was not meant to be a permanent, polished transport network. It was an emergency artery. It existed to move what mattered most as fast as possible, while the larger logistics system tried to catch up. At first, the challenge looked simple on paper. Get loaded trucks from the beachhead and port areas to the forward depots. Keep them moving. Turn them around. Send them back. In practice, it was chaos waiting to happen. Civilian vehicles were still on the roads. Military traffic from every direction competed for space. Repairs lagged. Signage had to be created. Traffic control had to be enforced. So the army imposed order by brute clarity. The Red Ball route would use a one-way loop system. 2 parallel highways between the Normandy beachhead and Chartres were set aside, the northern route for eastbound loaded traffic, the southern route for returning trucks. As the armies crossed the Seine and drove beyond Paris, the route was extended farther east toward the new front. In other words, the road itself had to evolve as the campaign evolved. This is where the story stops looking like administration and starts looking like endurance. The Red Ball Express was not one famous convoy. It was a relentless cycle. Trucks loaded with gasoline, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and spare parts moved forward in all weather and at all hours. Military police enforced route discipline. Other traffic was barred. Drivers pushed through blacked-out conditions at night, mechanical wear by day, and a constant pressure to keep rolling no matter what had broken, overheated, or gone missing along the way. The route was designed to save time, but it also magnified risk. Once a vehicle entered the stream, the whole system depended on momentum. And then there were the men doing the driving. Most Red Ball drivers were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army that routinely assigned black troops to service and support roles rather than frontline combat. In one sense, that reflected the prejudice built into the wartime military system. In another, it created the workforce that kept the Allied advance alive at the exact moment it might have stalled. The contradiction sits at the center of the Red Ball Express legacy. These men were often denied equal treatment, equal recognition, and equal opportunity, yet they became indispensable to one of the most important operational rescue efforts of the campaign in Western Europe. By the end of the operation, more than 400,000 tons of supplies would be moved, and roughly 70 to 75% of the drivers were African American, depending on the count used by different military and museum sources. But here's the part that makes the system feel almost unbelievable. This was not trucking under normal conditions. The Red Ball Express expected 2 drivers for many vehicles, minimal delay, and near constant movement, because the entire point was to turn roads into a conveyor belt. The Army Transportation Museum notes that the pressure to keep them rolling defined the whole operation, and that pressure carried a price. Fatigue became routine. Maintenance slipped. Accidents increased. Vehicles wore down under punishing loads and schedules. It was not glamorous and it was not clean. It was a system that functioned by spending men and machines at a rate peacetime transport would never accept. And still, it worked, at least enough to keep catastrophe from taking hold. An average of around 900 vehicles could be on the road at a given time during the operation, and the system eventually delivered an estimated 12,000 tons of supplies per day at its peak. That scale matters because it shows the Red Ball Express was not a symbolic effort. It was an industrial solution built out of urgency. It connected rear areas and ports to armies that were outrunning every assumption made for a slower campaign. For 82 to 83 days, depending on how the period is counted, the Red Ball became the emergency answer to a campaign that refused to slow down just because the logistics map said it should. But here's the deeper problem. Even a successful emergency system can hide the fact that the larger supply picture is still under strain. Patton's Third Army is the clearest example. As the pursuit across France accelerated, fuel became the most unforgiving currency of the campaign. In late August, decisions about petroleum distribution favored other formations, and on August 31, Patton's daily gasoline allotment dropped sharply, from 400,000 gallons to 31,000 gallons. According to the U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum's Petroleum History. That did not just frustrate an aggressive commander. It exposed the central reality of the campaign. If fuel could not reach the spearheads, armored warfare became theater without movement. The Red Ball Express was helping solve the crisis, but the crisis was larger than any single road network. So by the time Red Ball drivers were hammering eastward in long loops through France, the stakes had become brutally simple. Either the Allies kept the flow moving, or the most promising exploitation of the war in Western Europe would slow to a crawl. Not because the Germans had restored the front everywhere. Not because Allied troops had lost their nerve. But because the campaign had reached the oldest military limit of all. Movement without sustainment is only a temporary illusion. And in the next phase, that illusion would be tested harder than ever, by distance, by overwork, by breakdowns, and by the moment commanders had to admit that logistics, not ambition, would decide how far victory could travel before it ran out of road. The Red Ball Express began as an emergency road network, but what made it historic was what happened next. The trucks did not simply cover a supply gap. They became the proof that the Allied advance had reached the edge of what improvisation could support. In Module 1, the front outran the railways, the ports lagged behind demand, and a segregated army turned thousands of mostly black drivers into the men holding the campaign together. Now the real question takes over. When the Red Ball starts succeeding, does that mean the crisis is solved, or does it mean the campaign has become even more dependent on a system never meant to carry so much for so long? As September 1944 unfolded, the Red Ball Express expanded under pressure rather than comfort. The route had already been extended east as the front moved beyond Paris, and the tonnage carried kept proving how essential the network had become. Army and museum histories agree on the broad scale. More than 400,000 tons moved during the life of the operation at a peak rate of roughly 12,000 tons per day, with nearly 6,000 vehicles involved at the high point. Those are staggering numbers, but the more revealing figure may be the simplest one. This was supposed to be temporary. Temporary systems are not designed for elegance. They are designed to keep failure away for one more day, then one more day after that. And the costs kept mounting. Drivers worked in blackout conditions at night. Vehicle maintenance was always one missed repair away from disaster. The Army Transportation Museum notes that fatigue and inadequate maintenance produced frequent accidents. The convoys often had to drive straight down the road's centerline to avoid danger along the shoulders, while military police guarded priority movement and kept unauthorized traffic away as best they could. Even when the enemy could not stop the system outright, friction could. Worn tires, failing brakes, engine trouble, lost sleep, weather, congestion, and the simple human exhaustion of doing the same dangerous run again and again. The Red Ball Express did not face only German resistance. It faced physics, time, and fatigue. But here's the twist. The Red Ball's greatest success also exposed its limit. Trucking could move a crisis forward. It could not permanently replace a functioning theater-wide supply system. That is why the operation's turning point is not a single dramatic ambush or one decisive convoy. The turning point is institutional. Allied commanders had to accept that logistics would determine operational reach. In practice, that meant priority choices, fuel allocations, road discipline, route extensions, and the recognition that even victorious armies could be forced to pause when support could not keep up. Official army histories describe the autumn pursuit as a period in which transportation developments, port capacity, and supply procedures became inseparable from combat planning. The Red Ball kept armies moving, but it also made visible the cost of moving faster than the theater could sustain. That has strategic consequences. In popular memory, the late summer and autumn of 1944 are often imagined as a simple race into Germany that slowed only when the enemy recovered. The logistic story is more complicated. Supply shortages shaped tempo. Fuel shaped priorities. Command decisions about who would be supplied first affected what offensives could continue and which ones had to wait. The Red Ball Express did not decide every operation on its own, but it sat underneath those decisions, carrying the material reality that made bold plans either feasible or impossible. That is why it belongs not at the margins of the campaign, but near its center. And still the trucks rolled. By the end of the operation, Red Ball drivers had supplied 28 divisions, according to the National World War II Museum. The total moved exceeded 412,000 tons. More than 121 million ton-miles were completed in just a matter of months, according to Army University Press studies built from official Army records. These are not just logistical statistics. They are measurements of operational survival. Every ton represented something an advancing army could not do without: fuel to move armor, artillery ammunition to maintain pressure, food to keep men in the line, replacement parts to keep vehicles from becoming dead weight on the roadside. Remove that flow, and the pursuit across France changes from a story of momentum into a story of forced delay. But here's another overlooked part of the payoff. The Red Ball Express became a lesson the U.S. Army never really forgot. Army studies published decades later still return to it when discussing sustainment, mobility, and the relationship between logistics and operational success. Not because the Red Ball was perfect, it clearly was not, but because it demonstrated how quickly a modern army can collide with the limits of its own support. It also showed that the solution in crisis may depend less on ideal organization than on disciplined improvisation, traffic control, labor, and sheer persistence. Put simply, the Red Ball Express is one of those rare wartime systems that was both a heroic success and an unmistakable warning. The final phase of the story is less cinematic, but it matters. The Red Ball Express ended on November 16, 1944. By then, more ports had become available, rail lines had been repaired, and pipelines were reducing the pressure on truck transport. The emergency artery had done its job. It did not disappear because it had become unimportant. It disappeared because the wider logistics system was finally catching up to a campaign that had outstripped it. That is the true measure of the operation. It bridged the most dangerous gap between breakthrough and sustainment. And that brings us to the human legacy. The Red Ball Express is often remembered as a marvel of trucking, organization, and wartime urgency. It was all of those things. But it was also a story about who did the work. In a segregated military system, African American soldiers were disproportionately assigned to support roles, then asked to perform one of the most punishing and essential missions of the entire campaign. They did it under unequal conditions, with limited recognition at the time, and with enormous consequences for the armies depending on them. Any honest account of the Red Ball Express has to leave space for that contradiction. The Army relied on black soldiers to sustain one of its greatest operational surges while refusing to offer them equal standing within the institution they were helping carry toward victory. So when people ask what the Red Ball Express really accomplished, the answer is larger than tonnage alone. It bought time for the Allied advance. It prevented a dangerous success from collapsing into a self-inflicted pause. It proved that logistics was not secondary to combat, but part of combat. And it left behind a legacy that is both military and moral, a reminder that campaigns are won not only by the troops who seize ground, but by the people who make it possible to keep going after the breakthrough. In 1944, the road to victory in France was not just marked by battlefields. It was marked by red circles on signposts, engines running into the night, and drivers carrying the war one truckload at a time. If this story changed how you think about victory in France, help this episode travel farther. Like, share, and subscribe, and turn on bell notifications for more World War II documentaries built around the decisions that mattered when the headlines moved on. And in the comments, tell me this: was the real turning point in 1944 the breakout at the front, or the moment the Allies found a way to keep that breakout supplied?